Welcome back. Happy July 13th, 2021. There was only one book on foreign policy in 1992 that anyone cared about. It was Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, about the end of the Cold War and the triumph of Western values seen through the Hegelian lens of historicism. You could not count the reviews and discussions and seminars and critiques it generated. There's not really a good modern analog. It was perhaps as big as The Closing of the American Mind. And it was a problematic book on a lot of fronts. For one thing, it did not foresee or describe previous militant Islam, a major ideological, if not geopolitical, failing. About Cuba, though, much in the news today, Dr. Fukuyama wrote this, quote, "The fact remained that from a low point in the early 1970s, when only a handful of Latin American countries were democratic, by the beginning of the 1990s, Cuba and Guyana were the only countries in the Western Hemisphere not permitting reasonably free elections," close quote. Of course, as we discussed yesterday, it's not like this phenomenon began in the 1970s or 1990s. It was true of Cuba under Castro, under communism, from the get-go in 1959. Now, Fukuyama would go on to write in his book, quote, "Communism, which had once portrayed itself as a higher and more advanced form of civilization than liberal democracy, would henceforth be associated with a high degree of political and economic backwardness. While communist power persists in the world, it has ceased to reflect a dynamic and appealing idea. Those who call themselves communists now find themselves fighting continuous rearguard actions to preserve something of their former position and power. Communists now find themselves in the unenviable position of defining an old and reactionary social order whose time has long since passed, like the monarchists who managed to survive into the 20th century. The ideological threat they once posed to liberal democracy is finished. And with the withdrawal of the Red Army from Eastern Europe, much of the military threat will be gone as well," close quote. Well, what of other authoritarianism, like Putinism? And how many self-proclaimed socialists were in the House of Representatives or Senate in 1992 when Fukuyama was writing this? Answer, none. Today, one U.S. senator, runner-up for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, and at least 4 members of the House of Representatives. And then several in Democratic Party leadership who continue to endorse all of the above against primary opposition, who continue to defend them, who continue to put them on important committees and send them money, including the National Democratic Congressional Committee and the National Democratic Senatorial Committee and the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate. We spoke yesterday of the apologists for Cuba and the Castro regime, from Harvard in 1959 to Barack Obama and Jeff Flake in 2014. Jeff Flake rewarded today by the Biden administration as the ambassador to Turkey. That joke pretty much writes itself, but it actually did happen. But despite the defense of Cuba from the likes of Barack Obama and Jeff Flake, the idea then that we had to do something new because, as Barack Obama said, quote, "what we had been doing wasn't working," close quote. And here we are with the previous president of Cuba, Fidel Castro's brother, saying he defeated the United States when Barack Obama reversed U.S. policy there, and he was in power. And here we are with what Whittaker Chambers called the screams. He wrote, "There are always the screams, and every ex-communist knows what I'm talking about." And here we are with an Amnesty International report that says this of Cuba. Now, keep in mind, this is 2 years after the Obama-Flake rapprochement with Cuba. The state, quoting Amnesty International from 2016, "The state of freedom of expression in Cuba, where activists continue to face arrest and harassment for speaking out against the government, is the Castro's darkest legacy. Over more than 5 decades documenting the state of human rights in Cuba, Amnesty International has recorded a relentless campaign against those who dare to speak out against the Cuban government's policies and practices. Over the years, the organization has documented hundreds of stories of prisoners of conscience, people detained by the government solely for peacefully exercising their right to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. The control of the state over all the aspects of Cubans' life remain a reality. Repression takes new forms in today's Cuba, including the wide use of short-term arrests and ongoing harassment of people who dare to publish their opinions, defend human rights, or challenge the arbitrary arrest of a relative. The government continues to limit access to the internet as a key way of controlling both access to information and freedom of expression. Only 25% of the Cuban population is able to get online, and only 5% of homes have internet access, close quote. Again, that was 2016, 2 years after Flake and Obama started giving Cuba American dollars. By the way, today, zero internet in Cuba. Zero. None. What's important to Kamala Harris is not her Caribbean roots, which one might say is a good thing, but then again, she has no problem affiliating with her background and ethnicity when it is to her benefit, or when it's just not anti-communist, I suppose. She's more concerned about the myth that minorities here in America don't have access to photocopiers, Xerox machines. Meanwhile, they're not allowed to even have the internet in Cuba. On that, she's silent. It's always America's crimes, even if invented. And as for elections here, unfair, modern Jim Crow 2.0, worst time to vote as a person of color than any other time in history, right? Meantime, no elections in Cuba, fraudulent ones in Iran, and nary a word from Biden or Harris. I'm particularly in mind of all this as I contemplate the assault on our Constitution from the left and the Democrats as well. Consider this from Harry Jaffa. Quote, "The disappearance of any reason for elections will be followed by the disappearance of constitutional government, since such government has no purpose apart from the purpose of elections." It goes without saying, of course, that all revealed religion must also come to an end. For what purpose is there in faith or God if history has revealed all? So what Obama and Biden and Jeff Flake did, how do we say it per Obama, didn't work. It didn't work with Cuba. It didn't work with Iran. Maybe sending money to tyrants is a bad idea, but then again, that was the basis of foreign policy for the Obama-Biden administration, from the Caribbean to the Middle East. Steve Hayward gives us this. One hopes that this is the beginning of the end for the Castro tyranny, in just the way that mass protests in Eastern Europe in 1989 presaged the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of that year and the collapse of communist rule shortly thereafter. There are reasons to worry about this scene, however. Protesters took to the streets in cities all around the country, according to media reports. Did these protests happen spontaneously? There are credible reports of building unrest among Cubans for several months now, but protests usually require some planning, coordination, communication. Cuba keeps a tight lid on communications, especially the internet. It is reported today that Cuba has shut down the internet to hinder further protest planning, as we reported above. Cuban intelligence is really good. Can it be they had no inkling that a protest might be reaching a critical mass? Or could this have been a false flag operation of Cuban intelligence to smoke out leading dissidents so as to identify and arrest them? There are lots of examples of the communist regimes of old in Eastern Europe actually setting up or running opposition groups for the very purpose of identifying and arresting potential troublemakers. And protests of any kind in Cuba are exceedingly rare. Keep your eye out to see if we get credible reports of mass arrests, though the Cuban government will likely do this quietly and out of sight of foreign observers to the largest extent possible. Maybe the Cuban regime has grown less competent. Wouldn't be the first time this has happened in a communist country, or has lost its nerve perhaps to some extent. Incompetence is actually the proximate cause of the Berlin Wall coming down in an instant in 1989, but it is good to bear in mind a central fact not that long ago. As Angela Codevilla once put it, communist rule collapsed when the rulers lost the will to shoot their own people in large enough numbers. Do we think Cuba's rulers have reached that point? I doubt it. Hope to be wrong about that. I know of a credible account from more than 25 years ago when someone asked Fidel and Raul Castro over a fancy dinner what would happen if they liberalized Cuba at all. One of the Castros answered, we'd all be hanging from lampposts in a week. Well, just an update from Cuba's biggest champion in the U.S. Senate, Bernie Sanders. Yesterday, he condemned America for the Cuban embargo, just like Cuban leadership does, just like Barack Obama did, just like Jeff Flake did. Meanwhile, I give you the full Whittaker Chambers quote, "Yet there is one experience which most sincere ex-communists share, whether or not they go only part way to the end of the question it poses or not. The daughter of a former German diplomat in Moscow was trying to explain to me why her father, who, as an enlightened modern man, had been extremely pro-communist, had become an implacable anti-communist after his time as a pro-communist. It was hard for her because as an enlightened modern girl, she shared the communist vision, but wasn't quite yet ready to call herself a communist, and she loved her father. And the irrationality of his defection had embarrassed her. He was immensely pro-Soviet once upon a time, she said, and then, you will laugh at me, but please don't. He was my father. One night in Moscow, he said he heard screams. That's all. Simply one night, he heard screams. A child of reason in the 20th century, she knew that there is a logic of the mind. She did not know that the soul has a logic that may be more compelling than the mind's. She did not know at all that she had swept away the logic of the mind, the logic of history, the logic of politics, the myth of the 20th century, with 5 annihilating words. One night, there were screams. America was founded to stop the screams. How we doing?